Okay, then I am going to move towards Sidney and his wonderful defense of poetry. I've taken this just from the top of this. So it's a defense of poetry, or an apology for poetry, however you want to present it. About the man Sidney himself, let me just say a few brief words. Sidney writes he's born in 1554, he dies in 1586. In other words, he lives for 32 years. He dies at a very young age. While he was writing, in his person and in his writing, he represented the aristocratic ideals of the Elizabethan period and the Renaissance man. He represented that figure. So he was at times a courtier, a soldier, a statesman, a scholar, and a poet. And he was a legendary figure in his person. So it's not just the poetry, it's Sidney himself. And he was the author of the very first English sonnet sequence, which I referred to earlier. And that became influential on Spenser, who became influential on less so Shakespeare, but more Milton, because in Spenser they became more Protestantized, if you will. And in the defense of poetry, he writes the landmark work of literary criticism in English. Let me give you a sense of the background there, or give you some of the background to understand what he's writing here. He is writing in a response in 1580 to a work that had been written a year before by a Puritan minister named Stephen Gosson, or Gosson, Gosson. So responding to a Puritan, so now we're in the Puritan age. Remember, the Reformation in England is happening, translation of Tyndale's New Testament around 1526. So we're talking 50 years later. And the Puritan movement, not only has the Reformation come to England, has influenced the monarchy, so that Elizabeth is a Protestant queen, but there is also an intention amongst the British people to further purify. You know, we're a Reformed church and we're always reforming, trying to reform our manners, trying to reform our politics, trying to reform our ethics, trying to reform all of life. And the Puritan minister, Stephen Gosson, publishes an attack on theaters. We often associate the Puritans with an attack on theater. And that attack is called the School of Abuse. And he dedicates the poem to this man here, Sir Philip Sidney. So, without permission, dedicates it to, quote, the right noble gentleman, Master Philip Sidney, Esquire. And Sidney then responds to it. That's what we have here in the Apology to Poetry. It's a response to Gosson's work. And it is called the defense of poetry, sometimes an apology for poetry. Same thing, apologetics is the defense. And although it does respond specifically to Gosson's charges, we can see that he does something more than that. He broadens the discussion to include classical literary theory, which we've already briefly sketched out on this course, in so far as we looked at Aristotle's poetics and we looked at Horace's views. So that, and we also looked at Plato's, however. And what's interesting is that Gosson draws heavily on Plato's objections to poetry. So he attacks poetry because of its abuses, its immoralities. And whereas Sidney's defense reads like a reply to Plato as much as anything. And in defending his poetry against Plato, he's defending poetry against Gosson. And now having said that, you can see the 14th, 15th century Italian humanists being echoed there as well. But he is very much presenting it in an Aristotelian fashion then, or even in terms of Horace's approach. Let me say one final thing. Sidney is born at Penshurst, the eldest son of Sir Henry Sidney and Mary Dudley, who's the daughter of the Duke of Northampton. And his godfather is none other than Philip II of Spain. He's named after Philip II of Spain, husband of Queen Mary I. So he's got Catholic forebears. In 1564, enters Shrewsbury School in Shropshire, and in 1568, a student at Christ Church and Oxford University, doesn't finish his degree. Reasons unclear. Could be the plague, which was breaking out at the time. It broke out there. Maybe that's why he didn't finish it. But he, instead of finishing his degree, he goes to the continent. Very much there's a sort of rite of passage called the Grand Tour, in which an English aristocrat, would-be scholar, leaves England and goes to Italy, the seat of the Renaissance, just like Milton himself did, in order to complete his education. So he goes to the place where the Renaissance first flourished and goes and visits various figures. Sidney did the same thing there. And while he's there, in Paris in 1572, the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre takes place, in which the Huguenots, the Protestants in France, are slaughtered in tens of thousands in a infamous act. So all that lying in the background. So there's politics, there's religion, there's the Renaissance part. Sidney being the son or the relation of Philip II, yet he's in Elizabethan England. So complexity all over the place in his family and his views of things. He's not a man that's simple to figure out, and he's responding to a Puritan attack on poetry written in quasi-Platonic terms, and he's going to defend it in quasi-Aristotelian terms. So all of that background. What this is, the defense of poetry, is a classical statement of Renaissance literary theory, largely because of its scope. It is vast in what it seeks to demonstrate, but it's also famous for its wit. Now, wit, let me say something about the word wit. That's not it. No, I left those. So this is my still brain dead. Let's try it with blue. There's a blue word. No, same thing. Okay, so wit. Wit in English is a type of humor, but it is humor informed by knowledge. Deriving from the Germanic word for to know, wissen. And so wit is a type of humor, but it's a humor informed by knowledge. It's the type of humor that's employed by the aristocrats in Shakespeare's plays. There's plays on words. It's not vulgar humor. It's not this type of humor used by Bottom and the sort that's used amongst the commoners in Shakespeare's plays, which is very vulgar and obvious in its associations, a little bit too obvious, in fact. And that's what makes it funny. So a child can laugh at this, and children do laugh at it, and Dumb and Dumber type stuff. Whereas the aristocrats have a type of humor, but it's informed by double meanings and irony and sophistication, that sort of thing. And Sidney's defense of poetry is full of urbane wit. Not really interested in the technical rules of poetry or of rhetoric. So in that sense, not like Aristotle. More treating poetry in a broader way. And although he's synthesizing the classical poetics of Horace I think he's also blazing a new trail here insofar as he's conjoining it with the Christian faith in some ways, although that's not going to be the main emphasis. It's still there. So it is a almost it's been called an encyclopedia of Renaissance humanism. Three major topics of the defense of poetry or apology for poetry. First, he defends the dignity of poetry against the charge that poetry is something that leads and appeals to the passions and leads to the degradation of humanity, which has been amply depicted in the Renaissance through the sorts of love affairs that I described earlier, and particularly the adultery that almost invariably ensues in those encounters as well. So the famous episode of Lancelot and Guinevere. It's not just the love for an unachievable woman, it's that the actual achievement of that forbidden woman and all the chaos that ensues from that. But Sidney will defend poetry as having a dignity, and the way he does this is by arguing it is superior to philosophy and history, which is very much of an Aristotelian defense. He says that poetry combines the moral precepts of philosophy with the examples that are furnished by history. So it's the best of both worlds. Now, he's not talking about poetry in general, but poetry when it's idealized. And that is how Aristotle defends poetry. In his Poetics, he's defending poetry and the poets against the charges that they're only corrosive. So that, in that sense, he's clearly Aristotelian. Secondly, he discusses the ethics of various genres. And in this sense, he's more like the Hellenistic period that I talked about, which were the background for Horace's discussion of these things. So he talks about the pastoral, the elegy, he talks about satire, he talks about comedy, he talks about tragedy, he talks about epic. All of these are his defense of poetry against those other things. So he talks about genres of poetry and the defense of the dignity of poetry in those genres. Secondly, he deals with the specific objections raised against poetry, not the general broad brush objection that it appeals to the passions and degrades us, but rather specifically. And the main charge is that the poet is a liar. Again, Plato says this. And he echoes the Italian poet Boccaccio in asserting that the poet, because he nothing affirms, therefore never lieth. He never says anything positive. He is therefore incapable of lying. He just simply represents what's already there. He presents in mythological terms. He doesn't present it in realistic terms in that sense. So he can't be accused of lying. And then the third part of the essay, it looks at the current state of English literature. So it's very much of it's a broad-ranging defense. And so in the third part, which is probably the least important and the least interesting to a modern audience, he makes comments about genre, diction, poetic figures, meter, rhyme, rhythm, and uses of the English vernacular compared to other European languages. And he does agree with Aristotle in holding up the unities of time, place, and action that Aristotle mentions in his Poetics, and says that English theater fails to observe these things. So he does accept that English poetics, and specifically dramatics, is problematic, but not on the moral front, but rather on the artistic front. It would be better if English drama was more unified in its portraiture. And I think we can see that influence on that in the English drama of Ben Jonson and of Shakespeare, where the action tends to take place all at once within, there's not a lot of time lag between the eras. Or if there is, it fails in Sidney's estimation. Question or comments about that before I come to the specifics of the defense? And reading this then. Note that it's dedicated to Edward Wotton. And Wotton is a significant figure in the emperor's court and talks about horsemanship. So it's an interesting way of introducing the poem. And it is a rhetorical gesture which pulls us into depiction and how depiction ought to proceed. And without spending too much time on that, he's going to come to the idea that poetry ought to be a form of imitation. Very Aristotelian emphasis. Let me see if I can find it here. Now let us go to a more Greece. So that truly, where is it? I want to neither let me deem too saucy. And now let us go to a more ordinary opening of him. That I think it's probably up here. No, it's not. Okay, I'm going through my pages here. Okay. I'll give you things that are repeated thereafter. He talks about the poet as a vates. Where is this in this? It is on page, page 256, which is not far down. By which he means an inspired figure, a figure of inspiration. Percy Shelley, in his defense of poesy, will refer to this as well. So there's something that comes from God that falls upon the poet that escapes rules and regulations. There's something that is divine of this. And among the Romans, a poet was called vates. I think we must have an abbreviated version in our text here. No? There it is. Oh, it says from in our, that's why. Okay. So here's the full text. Among the Romans, a poet was called vates. There it is. Which is as much as a diviner, foreseer, or prophet, and as by his conjoined words, vaticinium and vaticanari is manifest. So heavenly a title did that excellent people bestow upon this heart-ravishing knowledge. So it is a form of knowledge, and it is a form of almost reverent knowledge, a prophetic knowledge. And so this is part of his elevation of poetry as something that is of a vast dignity that transcends the merely philosophical and merely historical. So there he makes that, you're right, that's our problem here. And I'm going to have that problem in going from our book to this screen because of that. That's really annoying. The second thing I wanted to draw your attention to is not just that he appeals to that, but he also goes on to talk about poetry as an art of imitation. Now, this might be more challenging for me to find that, but I want to find it here. I am not going to be able to do it. I'm just going to read from this then. So on page 258, I won't worry about what's on the screen here. 258, he talks about poesy in the middle of the paragraph. Poesy, therefore, is an art of imitation, mimesis. We already spoken of this. And for so Aristotle termed it in the word mimesis, that is to say, a representing, counterfeiting, or figuring forth. To speak metaphorically, a speaking picture. With this end, to teach and delight. Note that I've emphasized this repeatedly, teaching and delighting. But what we have here is the vast, lengthy tradition, which in Latin is called ut pictura poesis. I'm sorry about the whiteboard marker. In fact, you can't really see it. Does that help a bit? Yeah, a little bit. So like a picture speaking. So that is the ideal here. Shakespeare will represent it in his play Hamlet when he will talk about the need to, as if 'twere to hold a mirror up to nature, to show her her true self. That's what Hamlet, in his disquisition on drama, says to the actors and the directors of the play within the play. And he's echoing in this whole tradition of like a picture painting and imitation and mimesis that comes with it. Now, what is being imitated? Well, what it is not being imitated is a historical account. There's an idealization in the imitation. So in the particular, you're seeing the purification of that, what it represents, an ideal there. So in every dramatic scene, you aren't just getting an exact representation of what happened historically, but rather the significance of that event as seen by the poet and showing us the moral worth of the situation. So some topics are more worthy of reflection than others, but it transcends the actual events. And today the criticism often comes about, well, you've taken liberties with the original text. That's not what actually happened. And the poet would say, of course, that's not what actually happened. What actually happened, the historian will deal with. The ethics of the situation, the philosopher will deal with. What I'm depicting is the philosophical truth being represented in a historical drama. So people are better than they are or worse than they are, but it's in order to show a moral interplay. That's what the poet then does here. So poesy, therefore, is an art of imitation, for so Aristotle termed it in the word mimesis, that is to say, a representing, counterfeiting, or figuring forth, to speak metaphorically, a speaking picture, with this end to teach and delight, the very things that Augustine talked about, echoing Horace. But remember that Horace was added to by Augustine because he said not only to teach and to delight, but also to move. And the movement side of it is the Christian side of it, because you're moving towards ultimate reality. That's the ordo amoris, right? You don't love things as they are. You love things because of he who is worthy of love. So you love this scene because it leads you further up and further in. That's Augustine's idea there. And Lewis mentions that in The Abolition of Man, right? He talks about the ordo amoris, which he says is central to all education. If you don't have that, you are not educating as a Christian. It's part of the whole consideration. So, to teach and to delight. Of this, there have been three general kinds. The chief, now he's dealing with genres, both in antiquity and excellency, were they that did imitate the unconceivable excellencies of God. So this is a form of writing and depiction. The unconceivable excellencies of God, he says. Such were David in his Psalms, Solomon in his Song of Songs, in his Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, Moses and Deborah in their hymns, and the writer of Job, which, beside other, the learned Emmanuel Tremellius and Franciscus Junius, do entitle the poetical part of the scripture. Note that even in the Renaissance, the writers are seeing the genre and of literature and poetry specifically in the Holy Writ. And against these none will speak that hath the Holy Ghost in due holy reverence. So nobody's going to object to poetry being in scripture. But note his defense of poetry is that the Bible itself uses poetry. So how can we abuse poetry and say that it only leads to the passions being led astray when God himself in his own holy word uses poetry? So it's a form of rebuttal. In this kind, though in a full wrong divinity, were Orpheus, Amphion, Homer in his hymns, and many others, both Greeks and Romans. And this poesy must be used by whosoever will follow St. James' counsel in singing psalms when they are merry, and I know is used with the fruit of comfort by some, when in sorrowful pangs of their death-bringing sins, they find the consolations of the never-leaving goodness. So that's the first kind. The first kind of speaking picture there for teaching and delighting is the poetry found in Scripture. Second kind are those that deal with matters philosophical, moral in nature, or astronomical in nature. I'm going to skip over that because almost nobody even reads these anymore. He refers to Cato in the moral realm of poetry, and Lucretius and Virgil's Georgics in the astronomical, or Manilius and Pontanus in the historic, or Lucan. I'll skip over that. But he says this, that this second sort is wrapped within the fold of the proposed subject and takes not the course of his own invention. And it goes on to the third. And what's the third form? Right poets, of whom chiefly this question ariseth, betwixt whom, and these second is such a kind of difference as betwixt the meaner sort of painters, who counterfeit only such faces as are set before them, and the more excellent, who having no law but wit, bestow that in colors upon you which is fittest for the eye to see. So there's an idealization. You're not just depicting. So if you ever do painting and are taught to paint, and a model will be put in front of you and you paint the model, you try to represent that. But the best painters don't try and depict the person in front of them, but the idealization of the person in front of them. And that's what he says is true of poets as well. They have no law but wit, and bestow that in colors upon which is fittest for the eye to see. So the idealization, moving in the direction of the sublime. Right? What we saw in when talking about the sublime back in classical poetics. So the most beautiful, the most virtuous thing is being represented. And for these third, be they which most properly do imitate, to teach and delight, and to imitate, borrow nothing of what is, hath been, or shall be, but only range with learned discretion into the divine consideration of what may be and should be. So at this point, they are departing wholly from historical context and towards the idealization of action and form in their writing. And now we get into the realm of the imagination, or even fantasy, which is very much a part of this whole era. So you start to see Elizabeth portrayed as the Virgin Queen, and the idealization of Elizabethan poetics, Sidney's Arcadia, this idealization of politics and person and virtuous individual that they think is the fit subject for Christian poetics. So the marriage then, as it were, of poetic form and Christian virtue in the character of a person. So no longer Laura, who I'm lusting after because she's got really lovely blonde hair, but rather the Virgin Queen, who represents a purity of character. And my poetry is the idealization, not of a female's beauty, but of feminine beauty. So that's what's going on. The same sort of thing you see in Tolkien's depiction of Galadriel. And she represents an idealization of womanhood, which we long to worship. And we do. And sometimes we led astray by that. But that's what the poets do here. And he says, for these third, be they which most properly do imitate, to teach and delight, and to imitate, borrow nothing of what is, hath been, or shall be, but only reign with learned discretion in the divine consideration of what may be and should be. These be they that, as the first and most noble sort, that may justly be termed vates, that is, divinely inspired poets. So these are weighted on in the excellentest languages and best understandings with the fore described name of poets. For these indeed do merely make to imitate, and imitate both to delight and teach, and delight to move men to take that goodness in hand. There you go, the Augustinian emphasis then, not just to teach and to delight, to move men, to imitate that goodness in hand, which without delight they would fly as from a stranger, and teach to make them know that goodness whereunto they are moved, which being the noblest scope to which ever any learning was directed, yet want there not idle tongues to bark at them. So in response to the charge that of the Puritan minister Stephen Gosson, that the poets degrade by their appeal to the passions, he says, not so. The ideal poet, the best poetry, makes us, on the contrary, love an object that we never see, and yet is represented in the very things that we do see. This is an ideal woman, and we do meet women, and they have an aspect of this. And the women that we meet want to be like that idealized woman, and we want women to be that way, and thereby poetry purifies manners and politics. Comments or questions? There. Okay. That's the most significant feature there. Let me go on then to the second feature then, this page 270. And there's a little excerpt there. the three dots, what follows below. So I carry on there. Now then, go we to the most important imputations laid to the poor poets. For aught I can yet learn, they are these. First, that there being many other more fruitful knowledges, a man might better spend his time in them than in this. Secondly, that is of poetry, that is the mother of lies. Thirdly, that it is the nurse of abuse, infecting us with many pestilent desires, with a siren's sweetness, drawing the mind to the serpent's tail of sinful fancies. And herein especially comedies give the largest field to ear, as Chaucer saith. How both in other nations and in ours, both poets did soften us. We were full of courage, given to marital exercises, the pillars of manlike liberty, and not lulled asleep in shady idleness with poets' pastime. And lastly, and chiefly, they cry out with open mouth as if they had overshot Robin Hood, that Plato banished them out of his commonwealth. Truly, this is much, if there be much truth in it. So the second set of charges, which I outlined at the beginning, is the objection that the poet is a liar and abuses this. So to the first charge, that there are more fruitful kinds of knowledges, he says this, first to the first, that a man might better spend his time is a reason, indeed, for not learning poetry. But it doth, as they say, but petere principium. It begs the question. For if it be, as I affirm, that no learning is so good as that which teacheth and moveth to virtue, and that none can both teach and move thereto so much as poetry, then is the conclusion manifest that ink and paper cannot be to a more profitable purpose employed. So moving a man to teach and to be virtuous is the ideal aim, and poetry is best suited to achieve that. And certainly then, though a man could grant their first assumption, it should follow, methinks very unwillingly, that good is not good because better is better. But I still and utterly deny that there is a sprung out of earth a more fruitful knowledge than poetry. To the second charge being that it's the mother of lies, he responds this way. To the second, therefore, that they should be the principal liars, I answer paradoxically, but truly, I think truly, that of all writers under the sun, the poet is the least liar. And though he would, as a poet can scarcely be a liar. The astronomer with his cousin, the geometrician, can hardly escape when they take upon them to measure the height of the stars. How often, think you, do the physicians lie when they aver things good for sicknesses, which afterwards send Charon a great number of souls drowned in a potion before they come to his ferry? So our physicians say, well, you just need to take this and it'll make you feel better, and it kills them. So you want to charge the poets with lying? How about the physicians who are appealing to astronomy and physics, and no less of the rest, which take upon them to affirm? Now, for the poet, he nothing affirms, and therefore never lieth. For as I take it, to lie is to affirm that to be true which is false. So, as the other artists, and especially the historian, affirming many things, can in the cloudy knowledge of mankind hardly escape from many lies. But the poet, as I said before, never affirmeth. The poet never maketh any circles about your imagination to conjure you to believe for true what he writes. He's making it up. You know he's making it up. He can't ever lie because he's always making it up. You don't, it's a fiction. The fiction exempts him from the charge of lying. The audience is aware that it's a fiction, but it's a fiction with meaning, but he's not lying because he never says something is true which is in fact false, or false which is true, because it's all a fictive portrait that he presents to us. He citeth not authorities of other histories, for even for his entry calleth the sweet muses to inspire into him a good invention, in troth not laboring to tell you what is or is not, but what should or should not be. So it idealizes the way Aristotle describes poetry. And therefore, though he recount things not true, which is the great charge of the post-Enlightenment era, that poets and fiction in general talks about things that aren't true in the sense that it never happened. And the poet mindset will just say yes, and nobody ever claimed otherwise. We understand that it's fictive. That doesn't mean it's not important. But we don't actually adhere to your weird empiricist fantasy that what we see in front of us is the way things ought to be. It's not teaching us anything if we just affirm the way it actually is. But teaching always involves not just the way it is, but the way it ought to be. And so we, by talking about things that aren't real, but ought to be real, are moving you to consider a better reality than the one you live in. And thereby, by living in that, you will become a better person and involve yourself in a better politics. And therefore, though he, that is this poet, recount things not true, yet because he telleth them not for true, he lieth not. Without we will say that Nathan lied in his speech before alleged to David. Remember, Nathan reprimands David for adultery by telling a story of a sheep taken away. Is he lying? Yes, he is. There is no man who had a sheep and took him from a poor man, etc. But it was for a purpose. Nathan is not to be charged with lying, but rather inventing a fiction to teach David in that situation, which as a wicked man durst scarce say. So think I none so simple would say that Aesop lied in the tales of his beasts. For who thinks that Aesop wrote it for actually true, were well worthy to have his name chronicled among the beasts he writeth of? What child is there that coming to a play and seeing Thebes written in great letters upon an old door doth believe that it is Thebes? In other words, everyone's aware that it's make-believe. Everyone, even a child. So they can't be accused of lying, because lying is to say something is true is false, or false is true. And poetry is a realm of the imagination. So now we see a presentation of the Renaissance view of the imagination, but not in the romanticist sense of the idealization of nature as if it were divine, but rather the idealization of human nature in its depictions. So if then a man can arrive to that child's age to know that the poet's persons and doings are but pictures that should be, and not stories that has been, they will never give the lie to things not affirmatively but allegorically and figuratively written. And therefore, as in history, looking for truth, they may go away well fraught with falsehood. So in poesy, looking but for fiction, they shall use the narration but as an imaginative ground plot of a profitable invention. So yes, it is fiction, and that's its beauty. It is fiction. It can't lie. It never purported to tell the truth as you are reducing it. So that was the second charge. The third charge was what? That it is the nurse of abuse. It fills us with pestilent desires. siren's sweetness drowning the mind of the serpent's tale of sinful fancies. That's the third charge. What's his response to this? Their third charge, how much it abuseth men's wit, training it to wanton sinfulness and lustful love. Again, probably responding to the Puritan Stephen Gosson. He says this, indeed, that is the principle, if not only abuse I can hear alleged. They say the comedies rather teach than reprehend amorous conceits. That is, they teach us to be amorous. They say the lyric as a poetic form is larded with passionate sonnets, which it is. From Petrarch onwards, larded with passionate sonnets. The elegy weeps the want of his mistress, and that even to the heroic Cupid hath ambitiously climbed. Alas, love, now he presents it in capitals, love, I would thou couldst as well defend thyself as thou canst offend others. I would those on whom thou dost attend could either put thee away or yield good reason why they keep thee. But grant love of beauty to be a beastly fault, though it be very hard, since only man and no beast hath that gift to discern beauty. Grant that lovely name of love to deserve all hateful reproaches, though even some of my masters, the philosophers, spend a good deal of their lamp oil in setting forth the excellency of it. Thinking probably here particularly of Plato's Symposium and his Phaedrus, where he talks about the love of the soul, the object of the soul. Grant, I say, whatsoever they will have granted, that not only love, but lust, but vanity, but, if they list, scurrility possesseth many leaves of the poet's books, yet think I, when this is granted, they will find their sentence may with good manners put the last words foremost, and not say that poetry abuseth men's wit, but that man's wit abuseth poetry. There you go. It's not poetry. It's the corruption of knowledge. You're blaming the vehicle for what's in the vehicle. Purify your knowledge. There's nothing wrong with poetry in and of itself. For I will not deny that what man's wit may make poesy, which should be ikastatike, which some learned have defined figuring forth good things, to be fantastike, which doth contrariwise infect the fancy with unworthy objects, as the painter that should give to the eye either some excellent perspective or some fine picture fit for the building or fortification, or containing it in some notable example, as Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac, Judith killing Holofernes, David fighting with Goliath, may leave those and please an ill-pleased eye with wanton shows of better hidden matters. But what? Shall the abuse of a thing make the right use odious? Nay. So there are examples in poetry of the abuse of language, but that doesn't negate the very positive uses of poetry. So you don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. To use a terrible euphemism here. Nay, truly, though I yield that poesy may not only be abused, but that being abused by the reason of its sweet charming force, it can do no more hurt than any other army of words. Yet shall it be so far from concluding that the abused should give reproach to the abused, that contrariwise it is a good reason that whatsoever being abused doth most harm, being rightly used, and upon the right use each thing conceiveth his title, doth most good. So it might do the most harm, but that's because it's capable of doing the greatest good. So again, another angle on the argument for defending poetry and commending poetry. Even if it does the most harm, that's because it's also capable of doing the most good. And in this sense, it will fit with what we've seen earlier about Augustine in his Poetics and use and enjoyment. So we're using a thing rather than delighting in it for the thing, and the object needs to be delightful, yes, so it can lead to the degrading of people, but it can also lead to the exaltation. It is a quasi-Augustinian defense, I think, that Sidney makes here. Thoughts, comments? I think I've given you enough, I see. Yes.
I really appreciated this reading, especially like the beginning part, how he talks about poetry is really the best teacher because it's the best at reading and the best at writing. So therefore,
It's not just because of its capability, but also because its object is a philosophical or an idealized form, right?
But then the way that it's different from history and history and philosophy is that it doesn't require you any further knowledge
right.
to understand.
Right.
If you want to think someone philosophically, you kind of have to know about logic beforehand, and if you want to history, you kind of have to know a little bit about
a lot of it, in fact. You need a vast.
General, yeah, but poetry don't need any of that.
Which is why we can present it to children and teach them. And they grasp it intuitively, immediately, which is why you give children nursery rhymes. So then the subject of the nursery rhymes becomes of a terrific significance then as well. But it immediately, they understand the story, the moral of the story. They get it right away. It's easy for them to grasp. It moves their souls in the right direction. So the story matters. But yes, so I agree with you. I think it's a terrific defense. And it is a quasi, although I said Aristotelian, or you could even see Horatian, I think it's more Augustinian, because he sees in response to the charge of the Puritans that it is a school of abuse. It's on the contrary, it's a school of use. He could have even have said that. That would have been interesting. It's useful. It's exactly the opposite of the charge being made. So yes, the worst of poetry can lead to degradation, but that's because of the capacity of poetry to exalt us, make us better than what we are. So I think it's a terrific defense, and very unique, very much a part of its period, but I think also purified by Christian sentiments in a way that the Renaissance isn't always. So the Renaissance often deviates from that course and becomes very much bacchanalian and very, Italian city-states are notoriously bloody and corrupt and full of immorality and so forth. Leads to the bonfire, the vanities and all that. Religious sensibilities are being quickened by the corruption that comes from the Renaissance, the depiction of lustful things and so forth. But in the English Renaissance, I think we get the fusion to some degree of the Renaissance with the Reformation, which is the reason why 16th and 17th century poetry is the golden age of English letters. It is the golden age because it combines the two. Anyone else have a comment or a question here? This principle of imitation that Sidney enunciates here will reign unchallenged in literary theory from the time that he writes it in the Renaissance all the way to the end of the 18th century. So we'll include what we will call the neoclassical era, which I'm going to talk about subsequently, but it will reign all the way up until the Romantics come on scene. I just want you to note that. So the idea of imitation as the ideal, like a picture painting, ut pictura poesis, will govern English thinking. And when it breaks out and it deviates, the central question is, what is the nature of nature? Boy, is it ever squeaky. What's the nature of nature? That's where stop doing that. What's the nature of nature? That's when we move away from imitation towards a discussion of nature in the Romantic poets and originality. And rather than imitation of an effulgence from within, the spirit of the poet being expressed rather than the object being depicted, like a picture. You're depicting that, imitating it. Now you're expressing yourself. That's the Romantic poetics of expression. Well, I'll talk more about that when we move into the discussion of the Romantics. We're a couple classes away from that. In fact, we're a few classes away from that. I'm going to talk about the 18th century and neoclassicism and some of the significant events that lead up to the Romantic period. I think necessary background material, but I'll leave it off with that today. And